Yo, I'm blowing up. It's Kate, Grand Central. Let's hit it.
What the heck did we just watch? What was that yellow device? Does that yellow device transmit wirelessly? What does this have to do with NWA? All this and more we will discuss today. Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Smith. I am a CTO, CISO, bunch of other things. Today, I am our resident evil genius, and I'm joined today by Sam. Sam, who are you?
Hey, Sam Schneider here. IT operations security. Love all things security. And we're here for this week's Security Sync.
So I want to start with two things. The first one is in that video clip that I showed you, very, very short. What happens is in the movie Hackers from 1995, back when the internet went squawy, raw, boing, 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 because it was all modems, it was all phone modems. The movie Hackers came out, and they actually were coordinating a hacking attack with some physical stuff. So they tied up all the traffic, but then they all went into the New York subway, used acoustic couplers to tap into the phone lines there and dial in and hack a mainframe in order to get evidence to prove that one of the antagonists was stealing money and blaming it on hackers. So they used the pager, which is the yellow device, in order to coordinate a time and a place where they were all going to meet up. Okay. So that's the first part. Well, like what was going on there? The second part is more of a question for you, Sam. Have you ever had a pager? Like, what's your use of pagers?
Oh my goodness. They're called the electronic leash, and they're called that for a reason, right? So back in the 90s and early 2000s, I had many, many pagers, including a very cool pager watch, right? It was a Timex watch with a pager capability, so I didn't actually have to carry the leash itself. This was typically a thing for like on-call staff of some type. So if you're a doctor or you're on call for, let's say, IT operations rotations, things like that, watching servers, etc., you would typically carry one. And as you mentioned in the video clip, drug dealers were widely known to carry these, right? They don't have GPS, and they're only a one-way communication device, so you can't track anyone down with it. You simply put an alphanumeric type of string that goes to that pager to let them know, hey, call me at such and such number.
Yeah,
right?
for those of us that are younger, I'm not younger, by the way, but for those of us that are younger, think of it like SMS, but it's only one way. You can't reply. So a lot of times what would happen is people would send you a pager, and they just give you a callback number. And then because we didn't have mobile phones then, they were incredibly expensive or they just didn't exist yet. You would go to the local payphone or whatever phone that was around you and call that callback number.
Yeah, that's true. And what's really cool about this, there are multiple iterations of different types of pager technology out there. So the vast majority of what you see is a one-way alphanumeric, limited number of characters you could send. But then they had expanded characters where you can actually send data on them. And then we started getting into two-way pagers, and finally today we're actually seeing encrypted pagers as well. And that's very, very important because some of the uses that we will see or that we've seen is for things like hospitals, right, that are dealing with sensitive patient data and things of that nature. Also, emergency responders. So let me get into a quick history, if you don't mind, Mike.
Yeah, please.
So pagers is actually an older technology. They were developed as a radio technology back in the 50s and 60s. And they became very widely used in the 1980s and 90s. Like I said, mostly with anyone on call, right? Any on-call staff that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And the cool thing of it being when you're on call is that you could have the device and part of your handoff. So, hey, I'm not on shift anymore. You could hand it off to somebody else. And it was like you're physically passing the token to them. So that way they know that they're on call, right? Instead of the way we do it now, which is you end up in the, phone call tree or whatever.
The electronic wand. I'm handing it off to you. Here you go. You're officially it. Well, that's cool. We saw a decline in pagers or pager use with the widespread, adoption of cell phones, cellular technology that included text messaging, right? But think about text messaging, even up to like 2011, 12, it was expensive. And, I knew some people that had, $400-$500 monthly text message bills. Pagers were still much more of an economic option at that point. You're talking about $10-$12 a month, right?
Yeah. Even then today, SMS is still expensive if you're international, right? So when I lived in Asia, so I lived in Singapore. Malaysia is just right across the river, and people go back and forth all the time from Singapore to other places. International SMS, still crazy expensive.
Even with all of the economics changing, so now text messaging is very economical. I mean, you can send as much as you want. It doesn't cost you any more than your plan typically. Even with all of that, there's still a place for pagers in our society. They continue to be used by emergency services, hospitals. Today, they've expanded to hospitality, right? You go to a restaurant and they may give you a little pager disc to go back to, or a hotel. Now, that is actually in decline right now because after COVID, what ended up happening is you have to have staff to operate these things. So a lot of hospitalities reverted back to SMS because it's easy and most people carry a phone. Put in a phone number, we notify you. But emergency services and hospitals, they have very specific use, right? So if you've ever been deep in the bowels of a hospital, you may notice that you can go down these halls and you have no cell signal. Or if you go to an ICU, cell phones are not allowed. And most hospitals will tell you to turn off your cellular device when you come in. That's because you risk interfering with the equipment that they're using to treat yourself or to treat others. So that's why they turn that off. And quite frankly, even if you had it on, you may not reach the outside to receive an SMS or make a phone call or whatever because of the materials that are used in hospitals. So that's one reason. The other reason is if you look at something like an emergency response, look at 9/11, for example, where the cellular networks were overburdened and overrun. Now, there are some ways around that they have today. I think we've talked about this earlier.
There's a priority code.
Right.
So incident responders and emergency services in general have a code, a priority code that they use on their phones and things. So that way they can actually send messages. It prioritizes air traffic over, normal or seemingly normal people, such as myself and you.
Right. But having that dedicated network, that external network that's fed by satellites now, so satellites participate in that pager system, they have an alternative method or a backup method or maybe the primary method that they use. So they're not dependent on the same technology that everyone else is flooding at one time. Hospitals are the same way, right? I can't, for example, if a doctor were carrying a cell phone and dependent on SMS, he may or may not get it in a timely manner. Yeah. With a radio-based system like a pager system, you have a 2-mile coverage, and that's pretty much going to be throughout all of the hospital, right? There's going to be very low weak spots.
Yeah. So I got interested in pagers for a couple of reasons. One was I met a guy at DEF CON a couple of years ago, and he was talking about how a lot of data center operations, so you've got these huge mega data centers, they still use pager inside because you've got techs that are out, managing devices in the racks. And so they'll actually use pagers. And so sometimes they'll pass system credentials over that. So that's an interesting something. And then the other one was at DEF CON every year. And just so you know, we're recording this in the middle of August. And so we just got back from InfoSec summer camp, so Black Hat and DEF CON. But the RF Hackers Sanctuary has a capture the flag every year, and part of that capture the flag is pagers. And so I started looking, well, okay, how do you actually, how do you actually receive and transmit pager stuff? And that was kind of interesting, but it's also a capture the flag, so it's limited scope, right? And you have permission, so that skirts, and they use like non-standard frequencies. They use like LPD 433, kind of that sort of widget toy, and they broadcast at low power. So they do it safely. But that also brings up a question on legality, Sam. And I think you did a lot of research into that. What did you find out?
So it starts out with the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, very, very broad. And this is part of the issue with the laws that surround this, because just about everything is made illegal when intercepting any types of communication. Now, different states have very specific statutes, but you're still held by 18 U.S. Code 2511, for example. So this is one that we looked at. Interception and disclosure of wire, oral, or electronic communications is prohibited. So, it was really, really focused more on people who intentionally, threat actors who go out there and do this. It's really focused on any type of state-sponsored listening that occurs, right? Or switchboards or places like that, really, at the end of the day. But the letter of the law is very broad. And
it's incredibly broad.
if you intercept communications and disclose that information, and in some cases, this could even be interpreted as intercepting. And that's not a great thing. And quite frankly, I'm a little taken back by the language of it, because honestly, there needs to be some level of due diligence. And if you have HIPAA compliance guarding things like hospitals and so forth, who's watching the watchers, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if they're transmitting information or data over publicly accessible channels, and it happens to be, PHI data of some type, which, I suspect is probably happening. Can't confirm it. Will deny it. But I suspect that's happening. And if it is, who's watching the watchers? That information is out and available out there. So just need to be very, very cautious. And as always, don't violate the law. Research your state and federal laws before going out there and doing any of this.
Yeah. So I'm mixed feelings on it. Number one is that ECPA specifically calls out oral communication. So if I'm in a busy room and I hear two people talking, which I do all the time, thanks to the TISM, that is actually an illegal act.
That's exactly right.
Right. So that's overly broad. But then on the same hand, I know a lot of people that are sending sensitive information over pagers, and that, like, the law only protects you from good, upstanding, decent criminals who follow the law, right? So that, like, mixed feelings on that one. But I think the approach I want to take with this is, so you go out and you're an IT administrator, your company buys pagers. How can you actually tell if those pagers are sending encrypted messages or not, right? Like, a lot of times you don't know. And so being able to have the toolkit to tune to that frequency, view that pager traffic and determine for yourself if it's encrypted or not, that has a lot of value. And it has a lot of value when you do security audits, when you do self-assessment, when you do things like that. So I want to talk everybody through, how do you actually go determine if your pagers are encrypted or not?
It's really, really interesting. It's a very interesting topic, especially from the perspective of HIPAA, because they explicitly call out what data is allowed to be shared with security personnel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I believe that the true language in that is referencing to physical guards and people who redirect people in the hospitals and things like that.
Yeah.
But I did not see a specific allowance for information technology or others. Could miss it. I'm not a HIPAA expert in any means, but the cursory glance that we did through the regs, this is what I saw. So there are certain pieces of information you're allowed to give, like names and root numbers, right? But you're not allowed to do diagnosis, treatments, any of that other information that comes through.
Yeah. And there's just a simple like need to know, which applies in a lot of privacy, right? So like, what are you using this information for?
Right.
If you're using it to help secure systems, yeah, pretty good. But then probably you don't want to store it, right? You don't want to store it. But sometimes you need to just go to people and say, hey, look, your pager is unencrypted. Here it is. You can read this. Is this something that you want everybody to have access to? Now,
but
once you...
Isn't that a sticky wicket, though?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, think about it from a pen test or a red team perspective, right? You need, number one, you need to collect some form of evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to prove that this is the truth, right, at the end of the day? But with regard to data that is around HPI specifically, I mean, if you collect that data, you're in violation too.
Yeah.
So I mean, how do you do that? And you can't, as far as I read in that reg, you cannot sign away or get out of jail free card. You can't waiver.
Yeah, you just have to take steps to protect the privacy of the person whose data it is, right? Like, I think it's kind of like the don't be a jerk rule, right? Like, if you go, okay, this seems kind of bad. If it seems kind of bad, probably shouldn't do it.
Yeah, agreed. Due diligence, be smart.
Yep. Stay out of jail. Staying out of jail is good. So you want to show us what these signals look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. What we're going to focus on is two standards that we're talking about when it comes to pagers. We're going to talk about POCSAG and FLEX. And these are current standards. There are additionals as well, but we're going to focus on those two. They seem to be the most prevalent in use today.
Yeah, by far.
I'm going to start with POCSAG. This is actually an older standard. It's been around for a long, long time. And as a result, it covers a ton of frequencies. And most of this is in the FM frequency band. And what we're looking at here, you can see there are different European states out here or territories out here. European, UK, Germany. We see a bunch within the US as defined by the FAA, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these are actually...
That'd be the FCC.
FCC.
Sam deals with the FAA a lot. They cover planes. FCC covers communications and electronic signals.
This is not ADSB. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just an admin note there, the website that you're showing is the Signal Identification Wiki, which I use a lot because a lot of times you end up with, you're out there, you're just scanning, you find something and you're like, okay, cool. What is that crazy noise? And so the Signal Identification Wiki is really cool because it has frequencies that you might find that particular signal on. It's got audio sample. It shows you what the use is, tells you like how to decode it, a bunch of different stuff that's there. So I use Signal ID Wiki a lot.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resources. And if you wanted to see information on how to decode certain types of technology, what to use, Multimon-NG is a fantastic tool we use, right? And you'll probably see that in use here. I'm sure Mike uses that quite a bit. Mm-hmm. We did another video on RTL SDRs or different SDRs, including the H2 Portapack SDRs. So you can use different types of collection materials. And then there's some great additional informational links down here, Flex versus POCSAG, for example, and how you actually look at that information, all kinds of cool stuff out here to explore with, right? But without further ado, let's actually sample a signal, and we're going to sample. This will be, by the way, since we're following the rules and the laws, we're practicing due diligence. We're going to be actually collecting some information against a capture the flag type of piece that we found, but this is the only sound you're going to hear. We are not providing any additional sound clips, and this is on the SIG site, and this is the sample from that. I'm going to play a couple of seconds, and here's a sample of POCSAG. Those little breaks that you hear in there is actually data bouncing back and forth. It's a 0 or 1 type of flip, so it's actually sending that data back that way. And the second standard I want to share with you is a Motorola Flex, and it's much faster than the POCSAG standard. But there are 3 flavors we can look at here. If we're looking at the SIGWiki, 1600, 3200, and 6400 baud. And those
are incredibly slow if you're talking computer networks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But for us that grew up in the 300 baud generation, man, that's blazing.
Yeah.
2600 baud, all that stuff. So that's still a significant upgrade for the pager space as well on there. So it's pretty cool.
One thing that I like about this picture that you see there is that both POCSAG and FLEX, they send binary, okay? And so what happens is you have 2 frequencies. Some of the advanced FLEX stuff can do 4 channels, but right there what you see is 2 frequencies, and one is a 1 and one is a 0, and the signal bounces back and forth between those 2 poles. And if they have 4 channels or 4 frequencies, then one is a 0, one is a 1, one is a 2, one is a 4. Okay. And so in doing that, you can actually take data, you can just encode it, and you can send it as a binary signal and then decode it. And that's how they get that incredibly blazing fast, my face melting speed.
Yes, and the safety and security of a pager. Woohoo!
Yeah.
So if you look down here, you'll notice the frequency signature is much smaller in this. So we see a lot in the 929 range, a lot of custom pagers for radio frequencies from base stations are using 929. But you'll see others, right? 300 range, 931, 829, 148, and 52. So you'll see some in that as well. So once again, love this site. You have information how you can look at the decoding of that information. There's some recommendations, and here are more samples. So let's listen to what a flex signal will sound like. And it's really interesting if you've ever messed around with ham radio, things like that, or shortwave. You'll hear that sometimes. Sounds a lot like satellite communication to me, personally.
Yeah, it's a modem. If they provided that they transmit using the same frequency shift keying across 2 poles or two related but different frequencies, it's all going to sound like that. Maybe the rate of the data transmission will sound a little bit different, right? So, but usually with the pagers, you'll get this 2-second pop, because they're limited on how much data they can actually put into that message.
Yeah, I think that satellites, we used to use them at a large auto parts retailer that I used to work at. We used satellite communications back on the end, and the transcoders had a much higher data rate transfer than what you see in these typical standards up here.
Yeah. So let's get in and let me show you what these things look like live and how to actually tell if they're encrypted or not, and kind of build the pipeline. Now, I was interviewed at DEF CON by the DEF CON video team. I just walked by and I was checking out their recording gear, and they're like, "Hey, you want to be in an interview?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So we talked about the capture the flag at the RF Hacker Sanctuary and kind of what my pipeline looks like. Let me show you what that actually looks like. This is GQRX. We have a separate video on how to use GQRX and how to tune to stuff. For our purposes, I have a pager frequency that's here. And I want to check here and make sure I'm just using a regular Realtek, so the Nolec STR, just to regular one. In fact, this one's the smart one, so SMART, which has an aluminum housing. So that one usually stays connected to my computer. I'm going to use that today. And if I hit play here, start processing, you'll see a bunch of signals here. And you'll see this thing come up. And I'm going to blow this signal up a little bit, center it. You can actually see what it looks like when it comes across. Okay, so you see it as it comes across, right? You've got the pull to the left, the pull to the right, right? And the noise bounces back and forth between those two different pulls. So it's fairly identifiable. Sometimes you get a signal and you're like, I don't know if that's a pager. I don't know if that's FLEX or POCSAG, or there are different bit rates inside of that you're never quite sure of. But that's okay. You can identify that signal. They all kind of look the same. They all kind of sound the same. Okay. One of the tricks inside of GQRX, and I use this quite a bit. Oh, look, there's another one that came up next to it. One of the tricks that is inside of GQRX, and I use this a lot, is you go down here, you've got tabs in the lower right-hand corner, and you go here to the 3 dots, and that turns on some settings. So you've got one, which is FFT, fixed Fourier transform. That's how the display looks. Don't worry too much about that. You've got recording. You can give it a location where you record signals, and it'll record that as a WAV file. And you have network. And network here, what you do is you can actually stream that signal that GQRX is receiving. It can stream it as a UDP stream. And so in this case, I'm streaming it to localhost on UDP port 7355. Okay. Now to turn it on, right here, you have a little, it's called a radio button when you do UI design. It's just a push button, right? So you push it, it turns gray, and now it's turned on and it's sending data. Okay. Now that sends that UDP stream, you can capture it with Wireshark and TCP dump, but the way that, you can use it a lot is you use Netcat. So you can, I actually ran this earlier there. So Netcat, and there are different versions. There are 2 different versions of Netcat, in case nobody knows this. There's a GNU licensed one and there's a BSD one. Check, because I'll have the alternative command line for you, but there are 2 different commands. But all you do is you just use Netcat, you're listening UDP port 7355, and that's the port that we turned on. So if I hit that, you'll see that my screen starts speaking Klingon. And what that means is that Netcat, right? So there's my command. Netcat is actually receiving the signal and sending it to standard out, which means it displays it on the screen, but it has no way of like understanding what it is because it's all binary data. That's why you get the funny encoding, right? Is standard input output is trying to interpret that as ASCII characters, and it's failing horribly. Okay, which is okay, because we have a resource or a tool called Multimon-NG. So this is Multimon-NG. And what Multimon-NG is a decoder for a lot of different signal types. And if I scroll down here, you'll see all the different types. So Morse continuous wave, X10, which is using old school home automation. But you'll also see here it does POCSAG 512, 120, 2400. The numbers after POCSAG are the bit rate. So that's 512 bits per second, or baud. There's 1200, there's 2400 bits per second. It does Motorola FLEX. All of these are interesting to me when I start looking at pagers. Okay. So then there's another piece of software that's called SOCKS. And SOCKS is a command line audio editor. Okay. So you can use it on WAV files, things like that. And we'll actually use it to clean up the signal and package it up so that Multimon-NG can actually read it. I ran this one before, and it looks like this. So here's my command and my full stream, and I'll explain what it is. I'll also put this into the notes on the video so you can go reuse this yourself. So here's my regular Netcat, grab the signal, receive a data stream, and we're going to use a Unix pipe into SOCKS. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to encode it, and we're going to put it in 16-bit audio. We're going to sample it at 48,000 samples per second. We're going to basically clean it up, do the same thing, encode it again, and pass that file out as raw to standard output. Okay, so what that does is it just cleans up the signal. It gets rid of any kind of spikes that are out of band that'll cause Multimon-NG to crash, and it gets rid of that kind of noise floor, that like that static that's there. Okay, so we'll clean that up. Then we take that output, and instead of sending it to standard out, we pipe it through Multimon-NG. In this case, we're saying we're taking raw data. We are showing the scope, so that'll show us a nice little scope that shows us is it actually receiving or not. We'll say add a interpreter or a decoder for POCSAG 512, 1200, 4200, and FLEX, and then take the output of that and push it to standard out. So it looks like we've got a lot of extra dashes and stuff in there. We don't, those single dashes, there are a couple, there's one up here, there's one here. That just basically says take the output and put it to standard out. Okay, and we start running this, and I'm going to have to censor this because it will have, in fact, sensitive data. Okay, you'll see up here at the top, we are receiving signals when you see that start to flip. And I'm starting to see pager traffic come across. Okay, like everything, all you got to do is Control-C to quit it. And that's how you go and see if that pager traffic is coming across. Now, some things you'll see that come across is just random alphanumerics. In fact, a lot of it looks like base 64 alphanumerics. So that is data that's actually been encrypted. Other stuff will come across and it will be plain text. Then you turn around and go have a conversation with your communications department, maybe some of your business units, to say, hey, we've got this traffic that's coming across that is not encrypted.
Well, there are two things to that, right? Number one, it's the actual traffic, but number two, are they following the policy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, if you see plain text output and it's your devices, I think it's worthwhile to go have risk conversations with people, right? That is a HIPAA violation if it's PHI, right? Or if it's other type of data, right? That is, or it could just be potentially sensitive, right? Where are you at? What are you doing? Where are you going? Things like that. Now you can actually take that output, and you don't have to use GQRX. So I'm going to close down, stop GQRX, close it out. But you can use RTL-FM. And in this case, RTL-FM is a command line tuner, but you don't have any way to tell where your signal is at. So you need some kind of hint on what do you actually tune to? What frequency do you tune to? But here we've got RTL-FM, and it's sampling at 22,000 samples per second on a frequency of, and then I'm just taking the output and posting it raw or piping it raw through Multimon-NG with the same command line options. And if I hit that, boom, I start to get, here's my pager traffic coming across. So that works exactly the same, but you need to know which frequency to actually tune into, which is where GQRX can help a lot, because it's visual. It can help you determine where your signal, where the middle of your signal is, and what's the width of that particular signal.
So that's very cool. And, there are a lot of different tools and techniques out there to look at this data, but make sure that you are always in the white light, right? If one of the caveats in the US code specifically is if you get permission from the source owner. If you're doing this and you get permission from it, now that's exclusive of HIPAA, obviously, right? HIPAA is a whole different body in itself. But if you're looking at pager data itself, or you're looking at it for your company, just make sure that you have the get out of jail free card. So if you're doing red teams, pen testing, so forth, that's always great advice, right? Make sure that someone above you has signed off on this at the end of the day. But the tools that we used here today are all open source tools. They're very cool. But just make sure that you go out and check your state rules and regulations and laws, and just make sure that you are always above being targeted for something. Be very, very careful with what you share with other individuals if you see something, right? It's all about, I mean, the law is very, very broad, as Mike and I discussed earlier. And you could get in a lot of trouble very easily simply by mentioning something that's considered sensitive data. So you don't want to do that. I hope you found this useful. I hope you had fun with it. Go out and try this in your lab. Remember the lab video? Use your own lab, right? Do your own thing with it.
Yeah, and you can do it safe. So the way that the capture the flag works for RF Hacker Sanctuary is they transmit pager traffic, but they do it on the low power device frequency. So 433-ish, so which is actually 433.92. They do that, and they only transmit it inside of a local area. So you can use a Faraday cage. I have a Faraday bag that I use. You can, if you have a transmitter of some kind, you can put that inside of a microwave. Microwave is a Faraday cage. You can transmit on, just don't start it where you got all your stuff in there. All the magic smoke will come out. You can set up a transmitter on lower frequencies, or not lower frequencies, but lower power output, so that you're the only person who can actually hear it. There are a bunch of different ways that you can go experiment with pagers and still stay within the law. So be smart. If you're going to be a criminal, be a smart criminal. Stay out of jail. Having said all that, I am Mike Smith.
I'm Sam Schneider.